What do you do when your own parents see your husband's death as a financial opportunity? After losing her husband to a sudden heart attack, Rachel expected support from her family. Instead, they asked for a cut of the life insurance, while her daughter grieved in silence. But what started as heartbreak became a quiet war for justice, legacy, and dignity. With her 8-year-old daughter by her side and a secret Kevin left behind, Rachel uncovers the truth, draws her line, and redefines what it means to protect family. This is not just a story of grief, it's a story of standing up and staying free. The first thing I remember after the doctor said we did everything we could was silence. Not a wail, not a gasp, just silence. The kind that presses against your eardrums and makes the world feel unreal, like everything around you is being broadcast from behind a thick pane of glass. I nodded blankly, as if acknowledging some routine information. Your husband of 10 years is dead, then turned and walked out into the corridor, where fluorescent lights buzzed above my head like flies circling something already gone. It wasn't until I reached the parking garage that I realized I hadn't cried. Not once. Back home, Emma asked why Daddy missed her art show. Her ponytail was still tied with the blue ribbon Kevin had helped her pick out the night before. I parked the car, reached into the back seat, and held her hands in mine. I told her the truth in the gentlest words I could find. And still, nothing could soften the blow. Her scream shattered the air between us, primal and raw, a sound I would never forget. That night, I called my parents. I had always assumed they would be my first line of support. If not for me, then for their granddaughter. The phone rang 5 times before my mother answered, laughter and clinking glasses loud in the background. "Rachel," she said, distracted. "We're in the middle of Sophia's birthday dinner. Can this wait until tomorrow?" "No," I managed. "Kevin's gone. Heart attack this morning." There was a pause, then a soft, detached, "Oh, that's terrible. Are you sure?" As if I had misread a traffic report or gotten the time wrong for a movie. I told her I'd seen his body. I told her the ER doctor had pronounced him dead. My mother sighed, more inconvenienced than grief-stricken. "Well, it's just, today's not ideal, sweetheart. Maybe we come by tomorrow?" I hung up without answering. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday. Kevin's firm offered to handle the costs. His colleagues came in pressed suits, many with red-rimmed eyes. His parents, Diana and Robert, flew in from Arizona. Robert helped me choose the casket. Diana brought Emma a photo album titled Daddy and Me. My parents arrived late, missing the entire eulogy. My mother complained about traffic and whispered to me, Sophia had a hard time finding something to wear on such short notice. Short notice. As if death had been a brunch plan. I barely registered the condolences, the flowers, the murmured stories of Kevin's kindness. I moved through it all like a ghost. The only thing grounding me was Emma's small hand in mine, sticky from the apple juice someone had given her. Her face pale but composed. After the service, I overheard my father speaking to my Uncle James near the drink table. Kevin was on the partner track, wasn't he? Life insurance on someone like him must be substantial. It wasn't grief. It wasn't concern for me or for Emma. It was calculation. I excused myself from the group and locked myself in the guest bathroom. I stared into the mirror, not recognizing the woman who looked back at me. My black dress clung to my skin like a wet shroud. My hair was stiff with hairspray. I looked like a widow. I didn't feel like one. Not yet. I didn't feel anything until I opened the linen cabinet, reaching for a tissue, and found one of Kevin's dress shirts folded behind the towel. He must have left it there months ago. I buried my face in the collar. That was when the sobs finally came. Quiet at first, then uncontrollable. And that was also when I realized I was alone in this. Kevin was gone, and my family, they had never really been here at all. I didn't sleep that night. Emma had curled into my side, still wearing the same dress she had insisted on for the funeral, a soft blue one Kevin used to say made her look like a little sky. She clutched one of his old t-shirts against her chest, breathing shallow, twitching from bad dreams she couldn't yet explain. I lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the heater and the occasional car passing outside our apartment. Around 3 a.m., I slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. The fridge light was harsh, making everything feel sterile and wrong. I poured a glass of water, then picked up my phone. No missed calls. No voicemails. Not from my parents, not from my sister. Just one text from Jennifer, a coworker who barely knew Kevin, but offered to bring groceries. I scrolled through old messages, lingering on the last one Kevin sent me. Don't forget the real maple syrup, not the fake stuff. Love you. It had arrived exactly 27 minutes before Amanda called to say he'd collapsed in the office conference room. The timestamp felt like a cruel joke. Later that morning, as the city stirred to life beyond the windows, I received a brief message from my mother. Hope managing. Okay, let us know if you need help sorting through things. Help sorting through things. Not grief, not heartbreak, just logistics. Ellen, our neighbor from across the hall, knocked around noon carrying a casserole and a bag of groceries. She didn't say much, just hugged me, placed the food in the fridge, and sat with me at the table while I tried to make a list of people to notify. I found myself writing Kevin's name at the top before realizing and scratching it out. Let me know if Emma wants to come over, Ellen said quietly, or if you just need someone to sit here while you cry. I've done that for others before. Thank you, I whispered, but didn't cry, not yet. That night, Emma woke up screaming. I bolted upright as she clawed at the sheets, calling for her daddy. I held her until her sobs softened into hiccups, rocking her gently, whispering stories about Kevin, about how he learned soccer just to coach her team, about how he made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs on Saturdays, about how he once left a client meeting early because she had a sore throat and wanted him home. She eventually fell asleep in my lap and I stayed there, back aching, heart hollow, eyes wide open in the dark. The next morning I made coffee I couldn't drink and opened Kevin's home office. The smell of him, clean cotton and cedarwood, still clung to the air. His desk was neat as always, organized folders, a framed photo of the three of us at Lake Michigan, and a sealed envelope propped upright against his notebook, my name written on it in his handwriting. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I looked around and noticed the absence of chaos. Kevin had always said, in case anything ever happens, I want to make sure you never feel lost. I hadn't understood what he meant until now. Still holding the envelope, I sat in his chair and allowed myself to breathe. Just breathe. That afternoon, the phone rang. I recognized the number before I answered. Rachel, my father said, his voice practiced, calm. Your mother and I thought we'd come by tomorrow. Talk through some things. It's important. Talk about what? Well, he hesitated. With Kevin gone, there are practical matters. Life insurance, retirement accounts, your future, and Emma's, of course. I stared out the window, watching Emma draw hearts on the condensation with her finger. Sure, I said, voice flat. Come by, tomorrow's fine. I hung up before he could say anything else. The coldness in his tone wasn't new, but now for the first time I felt it without guilt, without confusion, without hope. Something was shifting inside me, and tomorrow I'd find out just how far they were willing to go. They arrived promptly at 10. My father in a navy golf shirt, ducked into khakis, my mother in a beige cardigan with a silk scarf that fluttered too dramatically for the occasion. They looked like a couple dropping by for brunch, not like people walking into the home of their recently widowed daughter. Emma had already left for school. Ellen, ever the quiet hero, offered to walk her so I wouldn't have to. "They don't deserve to see her," she said, and I hadn't argued. "Nice place," my father said as he stepped inside, glancing around as if evaluating it for resale. His eyes paused briefly on the built-in bookshelf Kevin had designed himself, then moved on. My mother walked straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge, uninvited, and sighed at the lack of fresh citrus. "I'll make coffee," I said automatically. My voice didn't sound like mine. We sat in the living room, the late morning sun slicing through the blinds in pale slats. My parents took their usual spots, the same ones they occupied during holidays and birthdays, making themselves at home in a space that no longer welcomed them. "So," my father began, placing his coffee mug on the table without a coaster, "we thought it was time to talk about your situation." "My situation," I repeated. "Yes," my mother chimed in. "Your financial situation, now that things have changed." "I see. Look," my father continued, steepling his fingers in that way he always did before delivering what he considered wisdom. "Your mother and I are not getting any younger. The market's been brutal lately. Healthcare costs are outrageous, and you know we've always done what we could to help you." I stared at him. "You think I owe you?" "It's not about owing," he said, almost offended. "It's about family. Kevin was doing very well, and I assume the life insurance reflects that. We thought, well, if you're in a position to help, a contribution might ease the strain we're under." "A contribution," I echoed. He nodded. "Something substantial, something fair, half, perhaps. And we also hoped you'd consider helping your sister. Samantha's had a rough few years." I blinked. "You want me to give you 50% of Kevin's life insurance payout, and another portion for Samantha? It's not unreasonable," my mother said, fiddling with her scarf. "We're your parents." I took a long breath, letting it settle deep in my chest. "Do you remember what you said to me the night Kevin died?" My mother frowned. "Darling, that was... You said, and I quote, 'Can this wait until tomorrow?' Because you were at a birthday party for Samantha. We didn't know how serious it was. You knew he was dead, I told you on the phone. And you didn't come. Not that night, not the next morning, not even for Emma." My father's jaw tightened. "There's no need to get emotional." That was when it hit me. They weren't here for me, not to grieve, not to offer support. They were here to audit my grief, to monetize my loss, to divide the value of my husband's death like it was a business transaction. "You can show yourselves out," I said quietly. "Rachel," my father said, rising from the couch, "be reasonable." I met his gaze, unblinking. "I buried the only man who ever made me feel safe, and now you're asking for a cut?" My mother stood as well, smoothing her cardigan. "We'll give you time to think. Just don't shut us out." But I already had. As the door clicked shut behind them, I sat on the edge of the couch, pulse steady, mind sharper than it had been in weeks. The numbness was gone. Something colder had taken its place, resolve, and something told me this was only the beginning. I didn't call them back. I didn't reply to the vague, guilt-laced texts my mother sent later that night. "We're just trying to help. You've always been too proud. Emma deserves to see her family." I left them unread. Instead, the next morning I called Thomas Reynolds. He had been Kevin's friend since law school, and more importantly, the one who'd helped us set up our estate plan 2 years ago, after Kevin's second health scare. He was precise, methodical, and the only person I trusted to tell me exactly what was mine and what wasn't anyone else's business. When I stepped into his office, tucked into a quiet brick building off Lake Street, he greeted me with a long, steady look and a glass of water already waiting at the corner of his desk. "I heard," he said simply. I nodded, unable to say the words again. "They came to my house," I said instead. "My parents. They want 50% of Kevin's life insurance and 15 for my sister." Thomas didn't react. He simply opened a leather binder, flipped to a tab labeled Whitman Estate, and began reviewing the documents we had signed together. "They don't have a legal claim to anything," he said calmly. "Kevin listed you as sole beneficiary for all policies and retirement accounts. Emma is protected by a separate education trust, and the remainder passes to you without probate. Your parents are not entitled to a cent. What if they try to contest it?" He looked up. "They'd be throwing money into a fire. The will is airtight, Rachel, and they'd have no standing. Kevin was mentally competent. The documents were executed properly, and they are neither dependents nor heirs under law." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "There's something else," I said quietly. "They're using guilt, leverage, playing the family card. I know they'll push harder. I need to be ready." Thomas nodded. "Then let me be the wall between you and their tactics. From this point forward, direct all communication through me and Rachel. Kevin made all of this clear for a reason. He wanted to protect you." I felt my throat tighten. I didn't know how much he saw this coming. Thomas stood and walked to the file cabinet in the corner. He returned with a smaller envelope. This arrived 3 weeks before his death. "Kevin asked me to hold it until the estate meeting, but I think now is the time." I hesitated before taking it. My name was written across the front in Kevin's unmistakable print, blocky and a little crooked from how he always held his pen too tight. Back home, I waited until Emma was asleep to open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper dated 3 months prior. If you're reading this, wretch, it means my heart finally gave out. And I hate that I didn't tell you more. I didn't want to worry you, but I did everything I could to prepare you. You and Emma are my legacy. I've locked in protections for her, even if people come knocking. Especially your father. He's approached me before, twice. Be careful, be strong, and above all, don't let guilt write your future. I love you both more than you'll ever know." I folded the letter slowly, hands trembling. Kevin had known, not just about his body's ticking clock, but about the vultures circling, even in life. He had protected us, the way he always did, quietly and with unwavering love. The next morning, Emma sat at the kitchen table drawing with her colored pencils. She looked up and asked, "Was Grandpa mad at you yesterday?" "A little," I said carefully. "Because of Daddy's money?" My hands paused over the coffee maker. "Why do you think that?" "I heard him," she said simply. "At the funeral. He told Uncle James you'd be set for life now." She picked up a yellow pencil and went back to shading. "Is that why he came over?" I sat down beside her, watching her tiny fingers grip the pencil. "Yes," I said finally. "That's exactly why." Emma nodded, serious. "Then maybe he needs a for being a real grandpa." And just like that, I knew this battle was no longer mine alone. I first noticed the manila envelope on Emma's desk 3 days after the confrontation. It was sealed with a single piece of tape and had her name in her own careful handwriting written across the top. For Grandpa and Grandma. I didn't open it. Something about the way it sat there, intentional, guarded, told me it wasn't mine to touch. But it stayed on my mind like a song stuck in the back of my head. Emma was different after that meeting. Not withdrawn exactly, but focused, serious in a way children shouldn't have to be. She spent long stretches in her room after school, quietly sketching and coloring. When I asked what she was working on, she'd just smile and say, "It's a surprise, but it's for Sunday." Sunday. The day my parents had summoned us for a so-called family meeting, as if their betrayal could be negotiated over coffee and cake. I had told Thomas about the planned gathering. He didn't flinch. "If they try anything legal or otherwise, send me a recording," he said. "But if it's just emotional coercion, remember, no is a full sentence." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I'd need to speak at all. Something told me Emma had plans of her own. Marcus had arrived the night before, unannounced, dragging his suitcase up our narrow stairs with a sheepish smile and tired eyes. He hadn't said much, just hugged me, then Emma, and offered to make scrambled eggs. We let him stay in Kevin's old office. He didn't ask, he just unpacked like he belonged. And somehow, he did. The morning of the meeting, I found Emma sitting at the table in her favorite navy dress. Her hair was brushed and pinned back exactly the way Kevin used to do it. She was holding the manila envelope like it was something sacred. "You don't have to go," I told her, kneeling beside her chair. "You don't have to do anything today that feels too heavy." Her eyes met mine, startlingly clear. "I'm going," she said. "For Daddy. And for you." I looked at Marcus, who just nodded once, solemn. We drove in silence. I parked outside my parents' house, the same Tudor-style home where I'd once tied my shoes for the first time, where I'd studied for the SATs at the kitchen island, where I'd walked down the stairs in a prom dress that my mother called too safe. It felt smaller now, less intimidating. Or maybe I had just grown beyond it. As we walked up the front steps, Emma reached for my hand. Her grip was steady. Inside, the living room was arranged like a courtroom. My father sat in his recliner like a judge, a document folder on his lap. My mother stood nearby, her face set, in polite condescension. Samantha lounged on the arm of the couch, scrolling through her phone, barely looking up. My aunts and uncles, Rita, James, Terry, and Barbara, were seated in various chairs, awkwardly avoiding my gaze. So it wasn't a family talk. It was a presentation. "Thank you for coming," my father said, as if we'd RSVP'd to a board meeting. "We have important matters to discuss." "I'm not here to negotiate," I replied. "We can talk in front of everyone," Emma said suddenly. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I brought something too." She clutched the envelope tighter. My mother blinked at her, mildly amused. "Sweetheart, the adults are having a serious conversation." Emma stepped forward, her small chin lifted. "So am I." A hush fell over the room. I had never been more still in my life. Emma opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Hand-drawn lines divided it into columns, each labeled in bold crayon: action, value, value, outcome. She held it high and began to read. "Being there when Daddy died, $0, 0 cents not provided. Asking me if I was okay, $0, 0 cents not provided. Asking me if I was okay, $0, 0 cents not provided." Her voice didn't waver once. "This is your invoice," she said. "This is what you earned." The room was silent, save for the low hum of the air conditioning kicking on. Emma stepped forward and handed the invoice to my father. He took it without a word, his hands visibly shaking. My mother leaned over his shoulder to read it, her expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and disbelief. Emma turned back to the room. "You only came to see us after Daddy died," she said. "Not to help, not to hug me, just to ask for money. But money isn't love." She looked at me then, eyes wide but calm, and I realized she wasn't trembling. She wasn't even nervous. She was resolute, steady, every ounce Kevin's daughter. Samantha finally looked up from her phone. "Oh, come on," she muttered. "Are we really taking life advice from a third grader?" "No," I said, standing. "But we are listening to the only person in this room who's shown any real clarity." My mother opened her mouth to respond, but my father raised a hand to stop her. He stared at the drawing, his jaw clenched. "This is emotional manipulation," he said, quieter than I expected. No, I said, this is accounting, just not the kind you're used to. My Aunt Barbara shifted in her chair. Brad, she said softly, maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is about fairness. You missed your son-in-law's funeral. You didn't even bring flowers. James looked down at his shoes. Rita pressed her lips together like she wanted to speak, but didn't know how. You all knew, I said, sweeping my gaze across the room. You knew what kind of people they've always been. You saw it growing up. The way they talked about Samantha like she walked on water. The way they made excuses for her when she lied, failed, cheated. And me? I was the one who followed the rules, got the scholarships, showed up, stayed quiet, and it never mattered. That's not true, my mother said sharply. It is, Barbara cut in, and it's been true for years. Samantha scoffed. Wow, so now we're ganging up on my parents because Rachel's husband died? I stepped forward, shaking now, not with fear but with fury. This has nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with greed. You didn't come to help. You didn't bring Emma a card or call to check on her. You came with a spreadsheet and a plan to gut the only security my daughter has left. You want 65% of the life insurance Kevin left for us. And for what? To fund your retirement and cover Samantha's rent? She's family, my father said stiffly. Kevin was family, I snapped. And you didn't even ask how he died. You just asked how much he was worth. A heavy silence fell again. Emma, still standing near the coffee table, walked over to Marcus, who opened his arms and held her close. He kissed the top of her head. My father set the paper down on the table with deliberate precision. You'll regret this, Rachel. No, I said. I regret trusting you for as long as I did. My mother's eyes welled, but whether from shame or anger, I couldn't tell. She stepped toward me, but I didn't move. You can still make this right, she whispered. I shook my head. You don't get to redefine right just because you're losing control. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder. We're done here, he said. I looked at Emma. Let's go. As we walked out of the house I grew up in, I didn't look back. Emma held my hand tightly, the manila envelope now tucked under her arm again like a shield. In the car, she was quiet, until I buckled her in. Did I do okay, Mom? I turned to her, my voice thick. You did more than okay. You were brave. You told the truth. You made them see. Emma smiled faintly. Daddy would be proud, right? I started the engine. He'd be in awe. Behind us, the house loomed like a monument to everything we were leaving behind, and in that moment, I knew. We hadn't just walked away from a meeting. We had walked away from a war, and we weren't coming back. The letter from my father arrived 2 days later, printed on his business stationery like a cease and desist from a man who'd spent his life mistaking power for love. The tone was cold, the words deliberate. He wrote that unless I was willing to revisit our financial discussion in good faith, he and my mother would be forced to reconsider their relationship with me and Emma. It wasn't even veiled. It was extortion by way of entitlement. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in my hand as I reread the line about how they had supported me through college and helped with the down payment on my first home, as if every dime they'd ever spent was now a deposit on my grief. Emma walked in, hair damp from her bath, her pajamas 2 inches too short at the ankle. Do I have to go to Grandma and Grandpa's? Again? No, I said, folding the letter slowly, sealing it back into its envelope. You don't? She nodded, then climbed onto the stool beside me and rested her chin on the counter. Good. They make my tummy feel tight. That night, I called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. They're not done, I told him. They've doubled down. I'm not surprised, he said. Your dad's the kind of man who thinks persistence is the same as righteousness. I think they'll try something legal. Then it's time we get ahead of them. We met with Thomas the next morning. He reviewed the letter, his brow furrowing slightly. They don't have a legal claim, he repeated, for what must have been the 5th time. But they're pressing emotionally. That's harder to defend against. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. You remember the letter Kevin left for you? Yes. Well, there's something else. Inside the folder was a certified copy of a trust Kevin had set up for Emma, separate from the general estate, untouchable, and dated 3 months before his death. I scanned the language. Education expenses, health emergencies, access granted only upon her 25th birthday, sole oversight, me. Thomas tapped a highlighted clause. This is ironclad, and look here. Kevin explicitly wrote that no funds are to be redirected, reassigned, or requested by any member of the extended family, regardless of perceived familial obligation. He used those words. I remember, he insisted. My throat tightened. He knew. He knew, Thomas said gently, and he acted. When I got home, Emma was at the table working on a new drawing. She had drawn our family, her, me, Kevin, and Marcus, standing together under a sky full of stars. Above our heads, she had written in block letters, "Family is who stays." I knelt down beside her. Emma, would you want to help me put together something for Daddy? A way to remember him? Her eyes lit up. Like a project? Something like that. Something that reminds people what he stood for. She thought for a moment, then said, Can we use his office? That's where his smartest ideas lived. Later that evening, I opened the door to Kevin's office for the first time since the funeral. The air smelled faintly of cedar and ink. His handwriting still filled the whiteboard near his desk, half-erased equations and financial notes. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing it in. Then I opened the bottom drawer and found something I didn't expect, a flash drive, labeled Legacy Private. I turned it over in my palm. It was Kevin's writing, sharp, underlined twice. And somehow I knew. Whatever was on that drive, it wasn't just numbers. It was a reckoning. And it was time. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, I plugged the flash drive into Kevin's old laptop. It took a moment to load. His folder system was meticulous, nested deep inside layers of dates and categories, but eventually I found a folder named simply 4R if anything happens. Inside were 3 files, a video, a PDF, and an audio recording labeled June Conversation with Brad. I clicked on the video first. The screen flickered, then Kevin's face appeared, framed by the dim light of his office lamp. He looked tired but focused, the kind of quiet determination I'd seen 100 times before when he was piecing together a client's retirement puzzle or mapping out our annual goals on the whiteboard. Hey, Rach, he said softly. If you're watching this, something went wrong. I hate that I can't be there to help you through it, but I also know you. You'll try to carry everything yourself. Don't. Not this time. He paused, exhaling slowly. I didn't tell you, but your dad approached me twice over the past year. Once about a real estate opportunity, and once about fronting cash for Samantha to launch some kind of candle business she couldn't explain. Both times he hinted that marrying into your family meant I should invest in their future. I said no, and I knew that would cause ripples. He leaned forward, his face closer to the lens. You've spent your whole life proving your worth to people who never deserved it. I wanted this trust to be something different, not leverage, not a test, just protection. For you. For Emma. My hand trembled on the mousepad. His voice was like a ghost warming the room. I also recorded a conversation, just in case. The screen went black. I opened the audio file next. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but I recognized the voices instantly. Kevin's calm, measured tone and my father's low transactional cadence. 50 grand, Kevin. That's not unreasonable. That's not going to happen, Brad. You're married to our daughter. This family supports each other. What's mine is hers is yours, and the reverse should apply. This isn't support, it's pressure. And I'm not obligated to bankroll your decisions. You keep saying obligated like this is some cold business deal. We're talking about family. There was a pause. Then Kevin's voice again, firmer. No. And I'm documenting this conversation, just so we're clear. The audio clicked off. I sat back, pulse racing. I hadn't known. Kevin hadn't told me how direct it had gotten, how bold my father had become, how much Kevin had shielded me from, not to hide the truth, but to give me peace. I opened the PDF last. It was a copy of the final trust documentation, annotated in Kevin's handwriting. In the margin, next to a clause about restrictions on third-party access, he had written, "If they come after you, show them this." I called Thomas the next morning and sent him all 3 files. He didn't need to say much. His silence said enough. "I think it's time we take this beyond just boundaries," I told him. Thomas agreed. "They crossed a line long ago, but now you have something they can't ignore." 3 days later, I received a formal response from my parents. Not an apology, not a retraction, a warning. If I didn't agree to a reasonable discussion of shared resources, they would be forced to reevaluate all relational ties and pursue what was rightfully theirs through legal means. They signed it in blue ink under the printed letterhead of Whitman & Co. Financial Planning. I showed the letter to Marcus, then folded it neatly and placed it in the same envelope as Kevin's voice, the one Emma had made. "This," I said quietly, "is the last time they get to pretend this is about family." Marcus nodded. "What are you going to do?" I looked down at Kevin's handwriting, at his underlined words, his quiet warnings wrapped in love. "I'm going to end it. On my terms. And for the first time since Kevin's death, I meant every word. The letter sat on my counter for 4 days before I decided what to do with it. Not because I didn't know how to respond. Quite the opposite. I knew exactly what I wanted to say. But I also understood what a response would cost. Once I answered, this would become permanent. Whatever small illusion of reconciliation remained would burn. So I took my time. In the meantime, Emma had begun to sleep better. She still asked about Kevin almost every night, questions that came from nowhere. What his favorite ice cream was, whether he ever believed in ghosts, if he thought birds understood people. I answered each one the best I could, tucking her in with stories instead of facts. It was easier to carry the weight of grief when she wasn't shouldering it alone. On the 5th day, Marcus found me sitting on the back porch with the letter open beside my laptop and a cup of coffee gone cold. "You going to respond?" he asked. I didn't look up. "I'm going to write a boundary." He pulled out a chair. "You know they'll see it as war. They already declared it. I'm just putting it in writing." I spent the next hour crafting a reply that didn't waver, didn't beg, and most of all, didn't apologize. I acknowledged the letter, the threats, the attempts to guilt me into compliance. I attached a copy of the audio file Kevin had recorded and informed them that all future communication would go through legal counsel. I stated in simple language that Emma and I would not tolerate further manipulation, and that any attempt to contact her at school, at home, or through third parties would be considered harassment. Then I signed it with my full name, Rachel Elizabeth Whitman. No rake, no sweetheart, no daughterhood implied. The next morning I hand-delivered it to Thomas, who nodded without asking questions and promised to send it by certified mail with legal enclosure. Afterward, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow, like I'd just buried something that had already been dead for years. That night, Emma came into the kitchen with a shoebox full of photos. Most of them were from the year before: her birthday party at the park, Halloween dressed as a dragon, a blurry shot of Kevin and her eating popsicles on the curb outside our building. She was organizing them in piles. "This one's going in the memory book," she said, holding up the popsicle picture. I knelt beside her. "That's a good one." She nodded, then hesitated. "Do you think they'll ever be sorry, Mom? Like, really sorry?" I thought of my mother's voice cracking at the meeting, of my father's threat-laced letter. I thought of Samantha's smirk, of every moment they'd chosen themselves over us. "I think they're capable of feeling regret," I said, "but not the kind that changes people. The kind that just makes them angry that they didn't win." Emma nodded slowly. "Then I don't want to see them anymore. Unless they're really, really different." "You don't have to," I said. "Not unless they earn it." She reached over and handed me a photo I hadn't seen in years. It was Kevin and me at the lake, arms wrapped around each other, our faces sunburned, laughing. I had forgotten that day, but she hadn't. "Can this one go in too?" she asked. I smiled. "Absolutely." And just like that, I realized something. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were curating. We were choosing what to keep and what to leave behind. The fallout came faster than I expected. 2 days after Thomas mailed the legal response, my mother showed up at Emma's school. I received the call from the principal, Mrs. Jensen, just after noon while I was filing client invoices at the office. Her voice was calm but firm. "Mrs. Whitman, your mother appeared unannounced at dismissal. She attempted to speak with Emma outside the gates." My stomach dropped. "Did she get to her?" "No. Emma was still inside. A teacher recognized your mother and intervened. She left without incident, but I felt you should know." I thanked her, promised to come by the next day, then sat in my chair for a full minute, pulse pounding in my ears. They had crossed the line again. Not with words or letters this time, but with presence, with proximity. When I got home, I didn't tell Emma right away. She was in her room, finishing a drawing of her and Kevin under a big oak tree, one they'd only visited once, but which lived vividly in her memory. I didn't want to disrupt the peace she was finally starting to rebuild. Instead, I sat with Marcus on the balcony after dinner, watching the city lights blink on beneath the dusk sky. "They're unraveling," I said. "They're losing control," he corrected. "And people like that don't go quietly." I sent a second notice through Thomas the next morning, a cease and desist this time. Emma's school tightened security and added her to a limited contact list, making it clear that only pre-approved guardians could approach her. Mrs. Jensen offered to assign a teacher aide to stand near her at pickup for the next few weeks. "Emma doesn't need to know all the details," she said gently. "But she'll feel safer if the adults around her are calm." For the first time since Kevin's death, I felt something that resembled relief, not because the threats had stopped, but because I was no longer reacting. I was building walls where there had once only been hope. The turning point came quietly, in the form of a phone call from my Aunt Barbara. "Rachel," she said, her voice low, "I just want you to know, not everyone agrees with how your parents have acted." I stepped into the hallway, heart racing. "What do you mean?" "They told the family the meeting was about setting up a memorial scholarship for Kevin. That's why we came. We didn't know they were going to demand money." Terry and I were horrified. "We've been silent too long." I didn't know what to say. For years, Barbara had been a neutral figure, cordial at holidays, polite in emails, but never someone I expected to step forward. "Thank you," I said finally. "It means more than you know." She hesitated. "There's something else. Your cousin, Jennifer, Samantha's daughter, emailed me. She's been following everything, and she doesn't support her mother either." I closed my eyes. The fracture was real now, not just between me and my parents, but within the family system that had quietly tolerated their dominance for decades. Later that night, I showed Emma the thank you card Jennifer had sent, a simple note saying she admired Emma's strength and was thinking of her. "She's from the other side, right?" Emma asked. I smiled. "Yeah, but she's not like them." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe we can build a new side, just with the good people." She placed the card in the memory book beside the photo of Kevin holding her at the lake. It felt right. And in that moment I realized the battle wasn't just about saying no to my parents. It was about saying yes to a new definition of family, one built on presence, not obligation, on earned trust, not blood. And Emma had already started building it, one memory at a time. The air that morning was crisp, a little too cold for late spring, but the kind Kevin would have loved. Clear, dry, promising. It marked exactly 1 year since the day we lost him. I had worried it would crush me, that the grief would return as sharp and all-consuming as it had been that first night. But instead it settled around me like a second skin, familiar, worn, quieter. Emma woke up early, already dressed in a navy blue dress, her hair braided the way Kevin used to do it. She didn't say much, just handed me a piece of folded paper. It was a new drawing for the memory book, a picture of Kevin sitting under a tree with a book in his hands and Emma beside him, looking up. "I added a squirrel," she said, "because Daddy always said squirrels were the funniest animals in the park." I kissed the top of her head. He'd love that. We were hosting the memorial in our backyard, not a somber affair. Emma insisted it be a celebration. Kevin's favorite music played softly from the speakers, and the grill smoked with barbecue ribs, his specialty. Friends, colleagues, neighbors, and those who had quietly become our family over the last year trickled in. Marcus, Tomei, Emma, Aunt Barbara, even Jennifer, who had flown in from Portland just to meet Emma in person. Absent were my parents. I hadn't sent them an invitation. Instead, I had sent them silence. They had made one last attempt weeks earlier, another letter, this time handwritten, with a softer tone. No demands, no threats, only acknowledgement. They had begun therapy. My mother claimed they were trying to understand where things had gone wrong. But by then, I had stopped waiting for their transformation. If change came, it had to arrive without expectation or performance. I owed Emma more than recycled promises. Still, their absence didn't feel bitter that day. It felt right. Marcus stood near the patio, a plate of ribs in one hand and a can of soda in the other. He had taken a job at a university in Chicago and now lived only 15 minutes away. True to his word, he had kept every promise Kevin had asked of him. "Think you'd approve?" he asked, nodding toward the setup, string lights woven through the trees. Emma's memory book displayed on a small table, guests laughing around platters of homemade food. I looked around. He'd roll his eyes at the music selection, but yeah, he'd approve. Emma made a small speech just before we lit the candles. She stood on a little stool and read from a note card she had decorated with glitter stars. "My daddy taught me to be kind, but not let people take advantage. He said being strong doesn't mean being mean. It means telling the truth even when it's hard. So that's what I try to do now, and I think he'd be proud of us." People clapped, some cried. I didn't move. I was still holding the image of her, small and brave, voice steady, like Kevin had folded himself into her spine and taught her how to stand tall in his absence. After the candles were lit and the stories shared, I slipped away from the crowd for a moment. I stood at the edge of the yard under the oak tree Kevin had once tried to hang a bird feeder on before giving up and bribing Emma with pancakes instead. In my hand was the flash drive again. I had one final legacy to build, not just for us, But for others like us, the ones left behind after loss, the ones rebuilding from betrayal, it wasn't revenge. It was inheritance of purpose, of protection, of truth. The next morning, the house was quiet. Emma was still asleep, curled in a blanket on the couch with the memory book clutched to her chest. The flickering light from the lamp next to her cast soft shadows across the room, making it feel sacred somehow, like a chapel filled with echoes of love and loss. I stepped into Kevin's old office, now converted into a shared workspace. His whiteboards still hung on the wall, but the math formulas had long been wiped clean. In their place were Emma's drawings, quotes clipped from books Kevin loved, and a calendar filled with deadlines for a new project we had begun building together. The Whitman Foundation was no longer just an idea. It was registered, funded, and staffed. Its mission clear: to provide financial literacy resources and legal support for widowed parents navigating grief and estate confusion. We had already partnered with 2 local family legal clinics and begun a pilot workshop series through Emma's school district. The flash drive Kevin left contained not only legal documentation, but a working model for a nonprofit he'd drafted in secret, complete with contacts, potential board members, and initial donor lists. He had started it all for me, and now I would carry it forward for others. As I reviewed one of the grant proposals, my phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. "Heard from Brad this morning. No more legal threats." He said, quote, "We understand now." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Later that afternoon, as Emma and I walked to the lake, Kevin's lake, she slipped her hand into mine. "Do you think Grandpa and Grandma really mean it this time?" she asked. I took a breath. I think they finally realized that saying sorry isn't the same as showing it. We'll see if they do the second part. She nodded thoughtfully. "Okay, but we don't have to let them back all at once, right?" I smiled. "No, sweetheart, you get to decide who has space in your life. That's your right." She grinned, then skipped ahead toward the water, her arms spread like wings. We reached the bench Kevin used to sit on during Sunday mornings with his coffee. Emma climbed up beside me, pulled a folded note from her pocket, and placed it under the stone plaque engraved with his name. "For him," she whispered, "in case he checks in." "What did you write?" I asked softly. She shrugged. "Just that we're okay, that I'm still drawing, that you're still strong, and that we're not scared anymore." The wind picked up, fluttering the edge of the note beneath the stone, but not lifting it away. We sat in silence, watching the sun begin to sink behind the tree line, the lake turning gold, and then orange, and then a soft, dusky lavender. "I miss him," Emma said. "I do too," I replied. "But missing him doesn't hurt as much now," she added. "It feels more like he's part of us." I nodded. "That's what love does. Even when the person's gone, the love stays." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "That's a good kind of inheritance." Yes, it is." In the end, Kevin left us more than money, more than a house or an office or legal protection. He left us a blueprint for resilience. He taught us how to stand our ground, how to forgive without surrendering, how to let go without forgetting. He taught us that family isn't determined by who claims you, but by who shows up. And we were showing up for each other, for the future, for the truth. This wasn't revenge. It was justice wrapped in grace. It was freedom, earned and finally lived. Thank you for staying with us through Rachel and Emma's journey, a story of loss, betrayal, resilience, and ultimately quiet triumph. If you've ever experienced family turning their back on you during your darkest hour, know this: you are not alone, and you are not powerless. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is say no more. To manipulation, to guilt, to inherited pain. Sometimes the strongest love is the kind that protects, not pleases. If this story resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your story if you feel safe. Let someone else know they're not the only one who had to build family from scratch. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next true-to-life drama about healing, justice, and the quiet heroes among us. Because family isn't who shares your blood, it's who shows up and stays. Thank you for watching.